ho! Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to my cozy Christmas corner with your host, me, Santa Zhane. Today, I'll be reading you 3 more fantastic holly jolly Christmas stories that we will follow up tonight. First up, the Polar Express. On Christmas Eve, many years ago, I lay quietly in my bed. I did not rustle the sheets. I breathed slowly and silently. I was listening for a sound Fred had told me I'd never hear, the ringing bells of Santa's sleigh. There is no Santa, my friend had insisted, but I knew he was wrong. Later that night, I did hear sounds, though not of ringing bells. From outside came the sound of hissing steam and squeaking metal. I looked through my window and saw a train standing perfectly still in front of my house. It was wrapped in an apron of steam. Snowflakes fell lightly around it. The conductor stood at the open door of one of the cars. He took a large pocket watch from his vest and looked up at my window. I put on my slippers and robe. I tiptoed downstairs and out the door. "All aboard!" the conductor cried out. I ran up to him. "Well," he said, "are you coming?" "Where?" I asked. "Why, to the North Pole, of course," was his answer. "This is the Polar Express." I took his outstretched hand and he pulled me aboard. The train was filled with other children, all in their pajamas and nightgowns. We sang Christmas carols and ate candies with nougat centers as white as snow. We drank hot cocoa as thick and rich as melted chocolate bars. Outside, the lights of towns and villages flickered in the distance as the Polar Express raced northward. Soon, there were no more lights to be seen. We traveled through cold, dark forests where lean wolves roamed and white-tailed rabbits hid from our train as it thundered through the quiet wilderness. We climbed mountains so high it seemed as if we could scrape the moon, but the Polar Express never slowed down. Faster and faster we ran along, rolling over peaks and through valleys like a car on a roller coaster. The mountains turned into hills, the hills to snow-covered plains. We crossed a barren desert of ice, the great polar ice cap. Lights appeared in the distance. They looked like the lights of a strange ocean liner sailing on a frozen sea. "There," said the conductor, "is the North Pole." The North Pole. It was a huge city standing alone at the top of the world, filled with factories where every Christmas toy was made. At first we saw no elves. "Their gallery got the center of the city," the conductor told us. "That is where Santa will give the first gift of Christmas." "Who receives the first gift?" we all asked. The conductor answered, "He will choose one of you." "Look!" shouted one of the children. "The elves!" Outside we saw hundreds of elves. As our train drew closer to the center of the North Pole, we slowed to a crawl. So crowded were the streets with Santa's helpers. When the Polar Express could go no farther, we stopped and the conductor led us outside. We pressed through the crowd to the edge of a large open circle. In front of us stood Santa's sleigh. The reindeer were excited. They pranced and paced, ringing the silver sleigh bells that hung from their harnesses. It was a magical sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Across the circle, the elves moved apart and Santa Claus appeared. The elves cheered wildly. He marched over to us and, pointing to me, said, "Let's have this fellow here." He jumped into his sleigh. The conductor handed me up. I sat on Santa's knee and he asked, "Now, what would you like for Christmas?" I knew that I could have any gift I could imagine, but the thing I wanted the most for Christmas was not inside Santa's giant bag. What I wanted more than anything was one silver bell from Santa's sleigh. When I asked, Santa smiled. Then he gave me a hug and told an elf to cut a bell from a reindeer's harness. The elf tossed it up to Santa. He stood, holding the bell high above him, and called out, "The first gift of Christmas!" A clock struck midnight as the elves roared their approval. Santa handed the bell to me, and I put it in my bathrobe pocket. The conductor helped me down from the sleigh. Santa shouted out the reindeer's names and cracked his whip. His team charged forward and climbed into the air. Santa circled once above us, then disappeared into the gold, dark polar sky. As soon as we were back inside the Polar Express, the other children asked me to see the bell. I reached into my pocket, but the only thing I found was a hole. I had lost the silver bell from Santa's sleigh. Let's hurry outside and look for it, one of the children said, but the train gave a sudden lurch and started moving. We were on our way home. It broke my heart to lose the bell. When the train reached my house, I sadly left the other children. They stood at my doorway and waved goodbye. The conductor said something from the moving train, but I couldn't hear him. What? I yelled out. He cupped his hands around his mouth. Merry Christmas! He shouted. The Polar Express let out a loud blast from his whistle and sped away. On Christmas morning, my little sister Sarah and I opened our presents. When it looked as if everything had been unwrapped, Sarah found one last small box behind the tree. It had my name on it. Inside was the silver bell. There was a note. Found this on the seat of my sleigh. Fix that hole in your pocket. Signed, Mr. C. I shook the bell. It made the most beautiful sound my sister and I had ever heard. But my mother said, "Oh, that's too bad." "Yes," said my father, "it's broken." When I chicked the bell, my parents had not heard a sound. At one time, most of my friends could even hear the bell. But as years passed, it fell silent for all of them. Even Sarah found one Christmas that she could no longer hear its sweet sound. Though I've grown old, the bell still rings for me as it does for all who truly believe. Now, on to Book 2, The Rag Coat. In winter, Papa carried me to church in a burlap feed sack because I didn't have a coat. Mama, Papa, Clemmy, and me, we'd all hitch a ride on Jeremy Miller's hay wagon and huddle under Mama's big quilt. I know Papa loved that quilt because he said it had all the nice bright colors of the day in it, and the day was something he hardly ever saw. He worked down in the black coal mines and didn't come up until the sun was gone. I told Papa it was warmer under that quilt than if I had a coat. He always laughed when I said that and told me, "Minna, you've got the right way of thinking. People only need people and nothing else. Don't you forget that." Pop got sick with the miner's coughs and couldn't work much, so Mama stitched day and night on her quilts to try to make some money. When I was old enough to start school, I couldn't go. They needed me at home to help Mama. I would card all her quilt stuffing and keep Clemmy's dirty fingers out of all that cotton. I made a doll for myself by stitching up some of Mama's quilt scraps and stuffing cotton inside. I talked to her like she was my friend because I didn't have any. Mama was too busy for much talk, but when Papa was home, he mostly stared out the window. The summer I was 8, Papa called me over to his rocking chair. I clumped up on his lap and he said, "You're getting big, Minna." "Too big for laps?" I asked. "Not too big for mine," he said softly, "but too big to still be at home. It's nearing time you went to school." I could hardly hold back my smiling just thinking about all the friends I would have. But I didn't want to leave Mama without a helper. "Papa," I said, "I can't go to school. Mother needs me here." Papa just looked at me real steady and said, "They have books at school, Minna. You can learn things from those books that you can't learn at home." "But I don't have a coat, Papa," I quietly reminded him. "Minna," he said, "don't you worry about a coat. I'll think of something." But he never got a chance. Papa died that summer. Everyone came at once that bought us food. I couldn't figure out how so many people could squeeze into our little cabin, but somehow they managed it. They all said they knew my Papa well. I sat on a stool back by the wood stove with Clemmy on my lap, so no one would step on us. I couldn't stand it. They all wore black like the coal mines that killed my Papa. He didn't even like black. He liked all the bright colors of the day. So why were they wearing black, I wondered. School started in September. Mama said I could go, but I decided not to. I still didn't have a coat to wear, and I knew it was no use starting something I'd have to quit when the weather turned cold. Other mothers who had children in school came over to quilt with Mama. I called them the quilting mothers. That fall, they were all working on a pattern called Joseph's Coat of Many Colors. I looked at it and said, "Aunt Joseph sure was lucky to have such a coat. I wish I had one like that." "Why do you say that, Minna?" Mrs. Miller asked me. "Because then I would go to school," I said, a little embarrassed that I had mentioned it. "Well now, Minna," said Mrs. Miller, I don't know that any of us has a spare coat we could hand down to you, but I'm sure we have some scraps to spare. We could piece them together, and you'd have a coat like Joseph's after all." Mrs. Miller looked around the room, and the other mothers nodded. Mama quickly protested. "You all need those rags for your own quilts. Don't go giving us things you need yourselves." They paid no attention to Mama. Mrs. Hunter said, "And we could use feed bags for the inside of the coat." My eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't embarrassed anymore. I said, "I have a feed sack Papa used to carry me in." I ran and fetched it. "Will this do?" "Yes, it would do just fine," they told me. Then I thought of something important. "But you need to make quilts to sell. You can't take time out to quilt a coat." "First things first," said Mrs. Miller, and they all repeated it. Mama smiled and shook her head, and I saw tears in her eyes too. The very next day, I went to school, planning most of the way to keep warm and thinking all the while of the coat I would soon have. The schoolhouse was just one room filled with 14 children. I'd seen most of them at church, but never got the chance to talk to them much. I knew I would love school, even though I was put in the front row with the youngest ones, and Clyde Bradshaw whispered that it was because I was dumb. Then Shane Hunter pulled my braid, and Susie Miller said I asked the teacher too many questions. But our teacher, Miss Campbell, smiled at me and said, "Smart people are those who have asked a lot of questions." My most favorite thing about school was sharing day. Each of us had our own day when we shared something special with the class. Clyde Bradshaw brought in the watch his grandpa gave him. It still ticked, and he made sure we all heard it. On her day, Lottie showed us the porcelain doll her aunt from New York had sent her. Oh, I thought it was the most beautiful thing ever and wanted to touch it, but Lottie wouldn't let anyone near it. She said, "Nope, it's mine," which made everybody mad. I knew just what I would show when it was my sharing day, but I kept it a secret. And I knew the quilting mothers would keep it a secret too. Each day I hurried home to see my coat. It was looking like the colors of the fall days. The yellow golds of the birch leaves, the silvery grays and the purples of the sky, the deep greens and browns of the pines, and the rusty reds of the chimney bricks. All the colors Papa would have chosen. I decided to put a piece of his work jacket in there. It just seemed right. The mothers worked as quickly as they could, but the cold weather was quicker. At recess, Susie asked me why I didn't wear a coat. I told her I couldn't jump rope as well as with one on. Jumping a lot kept me warm. I was fast becoming the best jump roper in the school. Not last night, but the night before, 24 robbers came knocking at my door. That was my favorite rope tune. One night when Mama looked sad, I told her things could be worse. We could have 24 robbers knocking at our door. She said, "Now, what on earth would they want from us, Minna?" "Oh, Mama, they would want a coat first thing," I said. She laughed, but I was most serious. Finally, my coat was done. It was so beautiful, and the quilting mothers had finished in time for my sharing day. That morning, I walked to my school looking down at all the different colored pieces of cloth in my coat. All the stories the quilting mothers had told me about the rags and who they belonged to, I knew by heart. I ended up choosing the most worn pieces for my coat because the best stories went with them. I was still looking down and repeating each story to myself when I bumped into Clyde outside the schoolyard. "Hey, rag coat!" And all the others laughed. Before I knew it, Susie, Lottie, and Clyde were all dancing around me singing, "Rag coat, rag coat." Lottie said, "Look, it's even dirty with soot." She poked her finger into my papa's glove. And Susie said, "Hey, Minna, you were better off with no coat than with that old ragged thing." "Maybe you're right," I yelled. "If I had no coat, I never would have come to school." I broke through their circle and ran away from them, far into the woods. I found an old log and sat on it for a long time, too angry to cry. I just stared across the fields Papa used to gaze at. "Oh, Papa, I wish you were here," I said, and then I couldn't help but cry. I cried for Papa, and I cried for the quilting mothers who had wasted their time. I was crying so hard, I rocked that old log. Then all at once I stopped because I felt something warm and familiar. The feed bag inside my coat made me feel like Papa's arms were around me again. I could almost hear him say, "Minna, people only need people and nothing else. Don't you forget that." I jumped off the log, wiped the tears from my cheeks, and brushed the leaves off my coat. "I won't forget it, Papa," I said, and I headed back to school. When I walked into the schoolroom, Mrs. Campbell looked up, surprised. "Why, Minna," she said, "I was told you went home sick." Susie jumped up, her face all red. "That's not true, Mrs. Campbell," she blurted out. We lied to you. Minna left because we made fun of her old coat. I'll tell her, Susie, I said. It's not an old coat. It's a new coat. It's just a bunch of old rags, said Lottie. It is not just a bunch of old rags, I said. My coat is full of stories about everybody here. They all looked at me, real puzzled. Don't you see? These are all your rags. They still seemed puzzled, so I showed them. Look, Zhane, here's a blanket of yours that your mama's sister gave her the night you were born. The midwife said you wouldn't live but 3 days because you were so small. Your mama wrapped you up tight in that blanket and put you in a little box by the wood stove. And your papa kept the fire all night for 3 weeks. Of course, you lived all right, I said, looking up at Zhane. Zhane was big, and you hung on to that blanket for years until it was nothing but shreds. My blanket, he whispered. I thought I'd never see it again. He looked at his old rag like he wanted to touch it. Then the others began discovering their old favorite things and crowded around me. They each wanted their story told, and I remembered every one. I even showed the piece of the woolen jacket Susie had let her calf wear when it was sick. Lottie's rag was a faded piece from the fancy dress her aunt from New York had sent her for her 7th birthday. And Clyde had a scrap from the pants that he always wore when he went fishing with his grandpa. Susie said, Minna, I am sure and sorry we ever said anything bad about your coat. Me too, I heard the others murmur. I wouldn't blame me if you didn't let us touch it, Lottie said. I wouldn't blame me if you didn't want to be our friend at all, said Clyde. Friends share, I said, and I let them each touch their rag. And I showed them the feed sack inside my coat and told them how it made me feel my papa's arms again. Zhane put his hand on my shoulder and said, Minna, I bet you got the warmest coat in school. Well, it took a whole lot of people to make it warm, I told him, and we all laughed. And now, the final story for tonight. It's a very, very beautiful one with a very special meaning. The Red Ribbon. Here we go. Not long ago, in a nearby land, the good king looked out over his kingdom. From high in the castle tower, he could see everything. Tall trees in the forest, beautiful gardens and farmlands, the crystal blue river, and all of the people who lived and worked in the village below. One could think, with all these beautiful things inside, the king would be very happy, but he wasn't. Instead, the king was quite sad. All he could see when he looked out his window was the terrible sadness in his kingdom. Because the people in the village were afraid, the king worried and worried, and the smile he once had turned into a big frown. The king knew if he didn't do something to stop the sadness, he and his kingdom might never be happy again. So the king sent royal messengers to find the wisest, most powerful people in all the land and invite them to the castle to help save the kingdom. He invited dukes and duchesses, princes and princesses, lords and scholars. When they arrived, he gathered them all in a big room to tell them about the terrible sadness he could see from his window. Help wanted. If you are wise, powerful, and free this weekend, I need your help. The king. My friends, he said, the kingdom has great forests with many trees for wood. Yet, I see people who have no houses. The crystal river is full of fish, and there are farms as far as the eye can see. Yet I see many people who are hungry because they have no food. There are people from many nations with much to share. Yet I see selfishness and fear. The saddest thing of all, the king said as his frown grew even bigger, though I listen as hard as I can, I hear no children laughing. I can see no children playing. They stay in their homes, afraid to come outside. My friends, I need your help. You are my last hope. If we don't stop the sadness, it will soon destroy the kingdom. At sounds of whispers filled the room as the guests tried hard to think of ways to help the king. Your Majesty, someone cried, perhaps you could send a brave knight to conquer this terrible sadness. Yes, yes, agreed everyone. Surely a brave knight could save the kingdom. The king, sitting on his throne, just shook his head. I've already tried that. I sent the mightiest knight in all the land to conquer the sadness. But it was too strong. My brave knight was defeated. I've got it, exclaimed another guest. Perhaps the kingdom is under an evil spell and a great wizard is near to stop the sadness. Again, everyone agreed. Yes, yes, surely a wizard could save the kingdom. Again the king shook his head. I'm sorry, my friends, but you see I tried that too. The sadness is not an evil spell. The wizard cannot help me. The king could see that even his wise and powerful friends had no ideas, and the frown on his face was now bigger than ever. Suddenly, from the back of the room, they heard a voice. Your Majesty, I know how to conquer the sadness. Everyone grew very quiet and all eyes looked to the back of the room as a man stepped forward from the shadows. They all stared as he made his way to the front. He seemed a plain, ordinary man dressed in plain, ordinary clothes. Over his shoulder he carried a curious leather sack that was brown and exceedingly large. When the man reached the throne, he politely knelt before the king, who asked, Do I know you, sir? Are you a prince or a duke or a brave knight? Before the man could answer, the guest shouted, He's a magician! Look, he's carrying a bag of tricks! The king inquired, Is that true? Are you a magician? Do you have magic that can heal my kingdom? The man smiled at the king. Your Majesty, I'm not a duke or a knight or a prince, and I'm certainly no magician. I'm just a simple weaver. I make cloth in the village below. A weaver? Marveled the king. Everyone started whispering again. The king squinted as he studied the stranger. How can you help me? The king asked. The man stood and explained, Though I am not a king or a prince or a magician, I know of a great power that can stop the sadness. Gather everyone in the kingdom and meet me at the castle gates as the sun rises. Do exactly as I say, and the kingdom will be saved. The guest cried, This man is just a weaver from the village. What power could he have that we do not know about? After all, we are the wisest and most powerful people in the land. There! Another guest quickly pointed to the weaver's sack. A magic power must be in that big brown sack. The room quieted once again. The king leaned forward, peered at the sack, and asked the weaver, Is the power to defeat the sadness in the leather sack he carried? The weaver thought for a moment, and then slowly leaned toward the king until their noses nearly touched. As I said before, your Majesty, gather everyone in the kingdom, meet me at sunrise, and you shall see. The king sat back in his throne and scratched his head. This I have not tried, he thought. This weaver's magic may be my only hope. Then he rose to his feet and commanded, Send the royal messengers! We will meet at sunrise and do as the weaver says. Wasting no time, the messengers rode throughout the land, telling everyone about the weaver and his plan to save the kingdom. The next morning, the king woke early and hurried down from the tower. When he arrived at the gates, he could see that a large crowd had gathered and everyone was excited about the weaver and his magic. Moments later, the weaver appeared, carrying his big brown sack. The crowd stepped aside as he made his way to the gates where the king waited. The king, feeling the need to say something official, cleared his throat and spoke, Loyal subjects, I give you the weaver! Before he could say more, everyone started cheering. The king raised one hand to silence the crowd, and with the other he pointed to the big brown sack and asked, Does this sack contain the magic that will stop the sadness and save my kingdom? Before the weaver could answer, the crowd cheered yet again. With that, the king stepped back and commanded, Let it begin! By now, the children had wiggled their way to the front of the crowd and formed a circle around the weaver and his leather sack. With their eyes wide, not making a sound, they watched the weaver kneel down and open his sack. Then he reached inside and gently pulled out a bright red ribbon. It was the most beautiful ribbon anyone had ever seen. It looked as if it could stretch for miles and miles and miles. The weaver then stood and held the ribbon high above his head. In order for the magic to work, he said, You must do exactly as I say. This ribbon must be taken through the village, down the streets, through the alleys, and across the fields. You must take it throughout the kingdom, from the giant mountains to the great blue sea. Remember this, the ribbon must never touch the ground. Now listen closely, very closely, for this is the most important part. Everyone in the kingdom must share this task. If anyone is left out, the magic will be broken and the sadness will return. Then the weaver took the end of the red ribbon and carefully placed it in the hands of a small boy standing at the front of the crowd. He told the boy to take the ribbon and lead the way throughout the kingdom. After the boy had taken a few steps into the crowd, the weaver shouted, Stop! The crowd gasped as the boy froze. Looking back over his shoulder, the boy could see that if he took one more step, the long ribbon would touch the ground. The crowd was silent. The weaver said nothing. The king was speechless. Then a tiny girl stepped out from the crowd and reaching out her little hands, lifted the sagging red ribbon above her head. Without a word, she and the young boy turned and carried the ribbon forward. Now everyone understood. One by one, the people of the kingdom stepped down to take their share of the ribbon. The baker followed the carpenter, who followed the school teacher, who followed the blacksmith. On and on they came to carry the bright red ribbon throughout the kingdom. Before long, hundreds of people were holding the ribbon that stretched from one corner of the kingdom to the other. They held it high above their heads, just like the little girl, so that it would never touch the ground. The king looked at the people and the ribbon stretching far into the distance. He looked at the leather sack and then at the weaver. "So," he said, "when does the magic begin?" "It has already begun," the weaver replied. And with that, he kindly took the king by the arm and led him along the great ribbon. Before long, they came to a young girl with a ribbon wrapped around her shoulders. She stood shivering in a thin and tattered dress. Next to her was a man in nice new clothes who could not help but ask, "Where's your coat, young lady? It is much too cold to be without a coat." "I have no coat, sir," the girl said. "No coat?" he exclaimed, waving his arms in the air. "Everyone should have a coat, and that includes you. You see, I'm a tailor. I make clothes, and I especially love making coats. Why, I have dozens of coats in my shop. I have green ones and orange ones, large ones and small ones, and I'm quite sure I have one just right for you. It would make me very happy to give you a coat to keep you warm." The little girl smiled. The king was amazed. It was the first time he'd seen the king. It was the first smell he'd seen in the kingdom in a long, long time. Even his crown was growing smaller. "The magic is working," he thought. Then he turned to the weaver and said, "Please, show me more." Next, they came to a very thin old man. Beside him, holding the ribbon, was a round lady wearing a white apron and a fluffy white hat. "What is that growling?" the lady asked. "Excuse me, ma'am," said the old man. "I have my stomach. I hope it didn't frighten you. I never heard such a growl from a tummy," the lady said. "Have you had nothing to eat today?" "No," said the old man. "I have no food for 2 days." "Heavens!" she cried. "No food for 2 whole days? Why, I could go no more than 2 minutes without a little something to silence my tummy." "Allow me to introduce myself. I am the village baker. If you come to my shop today, I'll fill your belly with warm bread and the finest cakes and pies in the kingdom." "Thank you, kind lady, but I have no money," the old man said. The baker thought for a moment. "My friend, I have an idea," she said. "I need someone to deliver my cakes and pies to the townspeople. If you will help me, I'll pay you a fair wage. That way, you can buy food and will never hear your tummy complain again." "I'll do it," the old man said. Again, the king was amazed by what he heard. His frown almost vanished, and he asked to see more. Soon, they came to the crystal river where 2 men from different nations, standing tall and proud, held their share of the ribbon. Neither man said a word. In fact, they were trying very hard not to notice each other at all. The men began to wonder how long they would have to stand there holding the ribbon. "We may be side by side forever," each man thought, "yet I cannot let go of the ribbon. I will not be the one to break the magic." As time passed, the men realized their stubbornness was silly. If they were going to be together for a long time, it would be much easier to talk rather than to ignore each other. Finally, the silence was broken. "I have noticed you have beautiful gardens on your side of the river," said one man. "You are quite a farmer. I would like to be able to grow vegetables like yours someday." "Thank you," the farmer said. "I see you have built yourself quite a barn. You must have cut the wood from the tall trees that grow on your side of the river. You are quite a woodsman. I would like to have a barn like that someday." The 2 men thought for a moment, and then each man looked at the other. "I have an idea," said the farmer. "I'll give you some of my vegetables and teach you to grow a garden like mine if you will show me how to build a barn like yours." "Show you how to build a barn?" exclaimed the woodsman. "I can do better than that. Not only will I show you how, I will give you the wood with which to build it." The 2 men didn't ignore each other anymore. That very day, they built a bridge across the river so they could share with one another. The king was delighted with what he had seen. His frown was completely gone, and a big smile had taken its place. The weaver and the king made their way throughout the entire kingdom. By now there was much celebration. People cheered, church bells rang, horns blew, and at long last the king could hear the laughter of children. The sadness was gone. The kingdom was saved. The king and the weaver returned to where it had all begun. Approaching the castle gates, they watched as the last person in the kingdom pulled the ribbon from the brown leather sack. Suddenly, the king began to panic. There was still more ribbon in the sack. It must not touch the ground, he thought, and so he raced to catch it. Before he could reach the big brown sack, the last few feet of ribbon lifted out and fluttered in the breeze. Slowly, very slowly, the red ribbon fell softly to the ground. The king dropped to his knees. His settled frown returned. A tear puddled in his eye and rolled down his cheek. The last hope to stop the sadness and to see if the kingdom is gone. What on earth will I do now? As the king stared at the ribbon lying on the ground, he noticed something wonderful. People were cheering, bells were ringing, horns were blowing, the children were laughing. Though the ribbon had touched the ground, the celebration had not stopped. The magic's still working, the king shouted as he jumped to his feet. My dear weaver, your red ribbon is more powerful and amazing than even you imagined. You must tell me how you made it. What is the magic? Where does it come from? The weaver, saying nothing, simply held out his hand and pointed toward the people. The king was puzzled. I don't understand, he said. Then he looked out into the faces of his people and listened to their voices. A big smile covered the king's face as he realized the magic is not in the weaver's ribbon. The true magic is in the hearts, hands, and hearts of those who embrace it. And throughout the land, from the castle to the valley, from the crystal river to the big blue sea, one person turned to another, and another to another, with smiles on their faces and laughter in their voices. They sang and danced, knowing that the kingdom was saved, and that as long as their hearts were joined together, they could conquer all sadness and live peacefully ever after. The beginning. And that's the end of our video. Thank you so much for joining me for my cozy corner. And be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe down below. And I will see you all next time. And I wish you all a Happy New Year and a wonderful Christmas Eve, everybody. Thanks for watching. Take care.